welcome to the podcast Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. This week, the largest rock concert ever, Watkins Glen Raceway in upstate New York. 600,000 people, an absolutely unbelievable sight. Well, our guest today, John Ramsey, is a major figure in Connecticut radio. He's general manager of WWUH in Hartford, station manager at WAPJ in Torrington, and chief engineer for WTIC in Hartford, just to name a few of the hats he wears. Now, when he was just 18 years old, John ran a pirate radio station with a few of his Connecticut buddies at this major rock concert. And just wait until you hear this story. And oh yes, your host, me, was one of the 600,000 people at the concert. So the two of us are going to be along in a moment to relive that experience from 50 years ago. This week's trivia question: the claim is that the first Christmas tree in the United States was in this Connecticut town. What town was it? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. It was the summer of 1973. Now, back then, rock concerts were a big deal. Woodstock had been held in 1969, and it drew 300,000 music lovers to the Catskill Mountains in New York State. A couple of years later, in 1972, in Hartford, there were a couple of up-and-coming rock concert promoters, Shelley Finkel and Jim Koplik, both in their 20s. They staged a concert at the former Dillon Stadium. They brought the Grateful Dead and a few members of the Allman Brothers to that stadium. Well, based on that, Jim and Shelley decided to do a bigger concert, the one adjacent to the Watkins Glen Motor Speedway, about 150 miles west of Albany. They would bring the Dead, the Allman Brothers, and the band to Watkins Glen in July of 1973. Well, that would become the largest rock concert in world history, still holds that title, doubling the turnout at Woodstock with 600,000 attendees. The audacious part of this story that you're going to hear today is that a half dozen Connecticut teenagers and one 20-year-old managed to pull off an incredible feat. They built a portable pirate radio station, they drove it to the site, and they broadcast for 5 days before, during, and after the concert. Now, John Ramsey was just 18, but he already had experience with technically illegal pirate radio broadcasting. He had run such a station in his parents' basement in West Hartford. Well, John teamed up with 20-year-old Jack Chamberlain. Jack was an employee at TV station WVIT Channel 30 in Connecticut to make all this happen. Well, John says it was all Jack's idea, and they only became introduced 10 days before the concert, but they managed to pull off this incredible feat. So, John, you and I are coming from really the same basic age group. You graduated, I think, in 73. I graduated in 72. We were both there at Watkins Glen, and we were both too young to go to Woodstock. So I'm going to enjoy this conversation because we have a lot in common, except that I went as an attendee, listening to music and having a good time. You went in a completely different way with a pirate radio station, and I just can't wait to talk about this. Now, I briefly introduced you as somebody who had a pirate radio station in your parents' home in West Hartford as a child, or at least a teenager. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I got bitten by the radio bug, Mike, early on. My dad had given me a little transistor radio to build, and I discovered broadcasting in the mid-'60s, radio stations, and that's during the Beatles revolution and the height of top 40 radio. So I really fell in love with radio broadcasting, and ended up building a little kit to make myself a hobby broadcaster so I could broadcast around the house, and that kind of evolved in bigger and bigger transmitters, and I had a station that played a lot of rock and jazz music, different forms of music that weren't very prevalent back in the Hartford area back in the late 60s, early 70s.
So WYBS was doing that in your parents' basement, and you had a 40-watt FM transmitter, which will be key to this story going forward because you needed that at Watkins Glen to actually broadcast. Now, the amazing part to me, there's so many amazing parts to this story of what you did, but one of them is that you're 18 years old. Jack Chamberlain is 20. He's the guy who says, hey, I was at the Grateful Dead show at Dillon Stadium in 1972 with Jim Koplik, and Shelley Finkel had done that one, and they wanted to do now, a bigger one. And Chamberlain had been there and he had heard about Woodstock and the problems. And he said, hey, let's do this radio station that'll broadcast traffic, information, just everything put together. You only got to meet him, is this correct, 10 days before you guys decided to put together this studio?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if I was aware that the Watkins Glen Summer Jam concert was going to be happening. I wasn't a huge Grateful Dead fan. I liked the Allman Brothers a lot, but I was involved with other things, and through a mutual friend, I got hooked up with Jack Chamberlain, who gets credit as the father of this project. He was the one that came up with the idea, and he didn't have an FM transmitter. He had an AM transmitter. He wanted to be AM and FM. That was important back then, particularly. So through a mutual friend, we got hooked up, and he discovered that I had a radio station and, more importantly, a 40-watt FM transmitter that I could bring along.
So now the concept is he's going to go to, I just love this, he's going to go to a rental facility and rent a trailer. And actually, as I understand your story, he actually had to lie and say, yeah, I'm going upstate to do some fishing with my dad or something like that. But no, I won't be going to this concert with this thing. And with his long hair at the time, the rental guy was a little suspicious that he was taking it for that purpose. And it turns out he did take it for that purpose. We'll come back to that later. But then, you guys had just a little bit of time to actually retrofit this trailer. Tell us what you did to it.
Well, 10 days gave us enough time to modify the trailer. We took out a bunch of the, carefully took out a lot of the bunks and the refrigerator and some of the kitchen stuff so we could put a portable radio studio in there along with our AM and FM transmitters so we could broadcast from the concert.
What kind of equipment? I mean, you had the transmitters. What else did you have to put in there? 2
turntables and some tape decks and a mixing console and amplifiers, and we had to bring along antennas and the transmitters themselves. So it was fairly full. And then record albums, of course. This is well before CDs or digital music, so we had to bring enough LPs. The idea was to broadcast before and after the concert our own programming, featuring often the band, the Grateful Dead and the Allman Brothers, the 3 bands that were going to be there. But we were also hoping to bring the concert to the people that got stuck in traffic because we had a feeling this was going to be like as big as Woodstock and that a lot of people wouldn't be within the range of the sound system on stage. So that is what we ended up doing.
Now, the other thing you did, of course, when you had to modify the trailer, you're taking out the stove and you're taking out the refrigerator so you'd have room for all your equipment. But you suddenly realized at the last minute, hey, guys, we're going to need some food here for the week. So you put together $110, you scraped together some money with your friends, and somebody went out and bought some supplies. What did they buy?
Well, we didn't, it was surprising that we didn't think of that until the last minute. But the night before we left, we sent somebody out to get the supplies with our cash that we scraped together. And then we get up to the site, 12, 18 hours later, and it's time for a meal. And we realize that we've spent the money on 10 cases of SpaghettiOs, which we had no way to heat because we'd taken the stove out, and about 8 or 10 cartons of our cases of Budweiser, which we had no way to cool because we'd taken the refrigerator out. So we thought we were going to be kind of stuck that way, but we ended up making friends with the local police. The state police had a mounted regiment there right adjacent to the press area. And in return for our doing traffic reports, using their helicopter pilot to do traffic reports, because they did close down the New York State Thruway. It was closed for 40 miles. In return for that, all of us got fed by the state police in their commissary. And to this day, it's some of the best food I ever had.
Love it. This was a pretty high-risk venture. You're going to, what you didn't know at the time was going to be the largest group of people ever assembled in the United States and the largest rock concert ever. But nevertheless, you didn't have a license to be operating a radio station from the site. So you picked the call letter CFR and explain the background on that.
Right. Well, American call letters start with either W or K, and Canadian call letters start with C, coincidentally. And we thought, slightly naively, that Watkins Glen was in upstate New York, so therefore it must be near the Canadian border. And, of course, it's not particularly near the Canadian border. But we were going to pretend that we were a Canadian broadcast station doing a live remote broadcast over the border, which would have been more palatable to the FCC should they discover it. So we were CFR, and that stood for Concert Free Radio. It turned out the FCC wasn't there or they didn't care, and the size of the crowd, I think, made it almost impossible. Even if the FCC was aware of us, they wouldn't have been able to get in because the roads were all closed. It's amazing to think about with 650,000 people there, 1 out of every 300 Americans were at Watkins Glen that weekend.
Which is just, it is a phenomenal statistic. Now, let's talk about you getting there, right? So you've modified the trailer. You're going to head up there. You leave plenty early because that was a smart thing to do. We knew there was going to be a lot of traffic. And you had a 4-vehicle caravan, a Jeep, a Blazer, a trailer, and we won't go into the Winnebago story so much, but you drive up there and you get within about 10 miles of the site and traffic stops. What happened next?
Well, we thought we were done. Luckily, Jack had press credentials from the TV station that he worked at, so he and Mike went ahead and walked up the front, and 30 minutes later, we see a state trooper coming down in the opposite direction because nobody was leaving Watkins Glen at that point on the other side of the road. And Jack and Mike were with him, and Jack and Mike talked the state troopers into giving us an escort because we were a media organization. So we got escorted on the other side of the yellow line against traffic, if you will, all the way into the campground.
So now when you get there, not only did you get this VIP treatment, but it turns out you're the first one at the press site, right?
We took up all the outlets, and it was an amazing sight that morning when we got there 2 days before the show officially started, seeing a huge open field with a giant stage and a giant sound system, and then a fence with literally 150 or 200,000 people on the other side of it, and then porta potties on our side lined up as far as you could see.
The surrealness of that site, having been there, I can absolutely vouch for it. It was just a phenomenal sea of humanity, and to have witnessed 600,000 people in one place was just amazing. But now, let's also figure out, your setting was absolutely perfect for what you were doing because you had the stage on one side and you had the heliport on the other, and they would bring with these golf carts some pretty impressive people right by your place.
Right. All the bands, you couldn't drive to Watkins Glen. It was all closed down during the Summer Jam concert, just like with Woodstock. Things were closed for miles around. So all the bands came in by helicopter and the crews. And so we had all the bands going right by us, literally 10 feet behind our trailer, our studio. And we got to meet a number of members of Bob Weir and Phil Lesh from the Grateful Dead. People from the Allman Brothers stopped by, and then Bill Graham was a promoter who worked with Tim and Shelley, Koplik and Finkel, to put the whole thing on. He hooked us up with Ron Winkersham, and that was an important part because one of the things that we'd forgotten to bring was enough wire to go from where we were in the press area to the stage, probably about 400 feet. We needed that much wire to connect into the sound system, assuming we got permission to use that.
Right, and so let's take that up just a little bit later. When you get Bill Graham to sit down with you, he's looking at you and seeing CFR, and you're saying, oh yeah, we're a Canadian station. What was his reaction?
I think at that point we weren't pretending we were Canadian anymore. I think we knew we were pretty much insulated from the FCC because of the crowds. We just told them we were a bunch of people wanted to broadcast the concert to the masses. We were already broadcasting our own music that time and our own programming and traffic reports and what they call health and welfare if there was a first aid issue or, you've heard all the announcements from Woodstock on the album, for instance, but the state police would make announcements through us of what was going on and where there was commissaries and first aid stations set up. But Billy Graham really liked the idea of us broadcasting it live, so he was the one that got us the opening with Ron Winkersham. Now, Ron was one of the owners of Alembic, which was the Grateful Dead sound company. They're in the history books because they had the largest sound system ever made, the Wall of Sound, which was debuted at Watkins Glen. And he was the one that he said, I don't have enough wire left over, but if you want, you can bring the transmitter up on the stage and broadcast from there.
So now, when you were broadcasting from the trailer, and this is an impressive, undertaking just by itself, you went about 5 days, 24/7, everybody taking shifts of 4 to 6 hours or thereabouts. You had to fill that time.
The other interesting story that happened was Jack was doing a show late at night. And Watkins Glen, if you haven't been there, it's up on a hill. You can see for miles, and that's one of the reasons why our FM signal got out so well, because an FM is a line-of-sight medium. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, we could see cars lined up. We could see headlights of cars for miles stopped on the highway. They couldn't get in. And the fact that headlights were on means that there were people in the cars. And Jack came out of the studio, went on the air and said, if you're listening to the radio station, flash your headlights. And he and I both went outside, and hundreds and hundreds of cars were flashing their headlights. So we think that as a domestic pirate radio station, we probably had the largest short-term audience because not only were there tens of thousands of people stuck in traffic listening to us, but it's 1973. You and your friends go to a huge concert, outdoor concert. You're going to camp out for a couple of days. This is before iPods, even before Walkmans. what do you bring with you? You bring a portable AM/FM radio. And upstate New York at that point had mostly gospel and country stations and a few rock stations that played the hits. So you tune into a station that's playing the type of music that is going to be on the concert. So we think we had a pretty large audience.
You had something else that was pretty interesting for a pirate radio station, which was with this agreement you had reached with the state police to broadcast traffic information and whatnot. They actually came on air with their traffic copters, didn't they?
Yeah, they didn't care that we didn't have a license. Helicopter pilots would either come on the air with us or just we'd interview them and write down what the traffic was like and what local roads were open and which ones were closed and what were the best way to get around. Because, it's not a hugely populated area, but there are lots of residents there that just wanted to conduct business. So the state police really appreciated the fact that we were able to provide that type of information on the air for them or spread the information to the public. And in return, they fed us, which was great.
Now, the other thing I want to run by here is go back to this story that you've started to tell a couple times, which is just phenomenal that you had been introduced to this sound man from the Grateful Dead's group that was providing this, as you say, revolutionary sound system that was debuted there at Watkins Glen. And what was so incredible, and I can't wait to hear your firsthand account of this, and said to you, hey, just bring your FM transmitter up on stage. So you actually went on the Watkins Glen stage while these guys were playing. Is that correct?
It was a great idea, but the problem was this was a Korean War surplus 40-watt FM transmitter that was, quote-unquote, Mike, man-portable. Well, that man-portable was 75 pounds. I weighed about twice that at the time. So carrying that 500 feet and then up on the stage wasn't much fun, but we did it. It had one handle on it. And we got that up on stage, and then I climbed the scaffolding in the rain to put up the antenna, 5 stories up. And I was determined I wasn't going to leave the transmitter behind because if I left it, I'd probably never get back up to retrieve it. So I stayed on stage for, well over 12 hours while the bands played, and then at the end they had the jam session with all 3 bands.
Can you just spend a second painting a picture verbally what the heck that was like?
Well, I got a tour backstage during one of the intermissions, and they had above-ground swimming pool sets set up for the crew and for the bands to swim in. They had several commissary tents and tables set up with food. I got to meet all the Grateful Dead's roadies. They had their own Winnebago. Then the show was going to start, so I went up on stage and stayed there the whole time. And it was quite a sight to be, 20 feet above the crowd looking out at over 500,000 people.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that in those years you were not a real fan of crowds. What were your thoughts when you saw just so many people?
In hindsight, I'm surprised I even went because I did have a bit of a fear of crowds. Not debilitating, but I wasn't comfortable in large crowds back then. Of all the people, we had 6 or 7 of us that came up to do the concert-free radio broadcast. I was the only one that didn't go out of the press area. The press area was secure, and it was never overrun, thank goodness. Everybody else took turns and went out into the crowd and would disappear for 24 or more hours and partake in all the things that were going on back then, but I didn't do that. And being up on stage, it was an experience of a lifetime to meet the bands and to see them up close while they were playing on the side of the stage. A lot of fun.
That's, I would think, a highlight for somebody who's had a career in radio like you have over the years. So let's talk about what happened after the concert, right? There was, obviously Saturday was an incredible day, although there was the thunderstorm that kind of threw people off for a bit there, but kind of turned it more into a Woodstock mudfest for a little bit. But at the end of the concert, it was done, and you guys weren't going to get out any faster than anybody else, so you stayed and continued broadcasting, right?
Right. We figured we'd be broadcasting for at least, we started 2 days before the show even started on stage. We figured we'd be there for another couple of days afterwards. So we stayed on and continued to broadcast and provided that safety information from the state police along with the helicopter traffic report.
Somewhere I read, and I think it was in your blog, that for roughly 35, 40 years, none of you guys ever really talked about it. You just kind of went your own ways afterwards. Does it dawn on you now the significance of what you did? Yeah,
there's a guy writing a book about the big concerts that came out after Woodstock. He's going to do a chapter on Summer Jam, and the radio station's going to be mentioned in there. And then there's also a group of local folks that are trying to produce a Hollywood movie on Summer Jam. And the radio station certainly would make a nice side note on that, a human interest story. It was the 50th anniversary last year, so there's been a lot. There's a Hartford Current article. There's been an interview on WTIC and some other stations. So, yeah, we didn't talk about it much. In fact, I hadn't seen Jack for 50 years. I got together with him this past summer. Jack Chamberlain, the guy who came up with the idea for concert-free radio from Summer Jam, and we got a chance to do an interview together just last summer. That was a lot of fun.
So I have to ask one question that I haven't seen anywhere else, which is, what the heck happened when you returned that rental trailer to the guy who was worried you were going to take it up to the concert?
Well, the only damage that we did, and that's part of the story about having warm beer and cold SpaghettiOs, is that we had inadvertently drilled a hole into the water tank, so there was no water. But we were able to fix that, and we fessed up, and we restored the trailer with that one exception back to original condition, and there was no issue after that.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today, John Ramsey, who remains a major figure in Connecticut radio, general manager of WWUH in Hartford, station manager of WAPJ in Torrington, chief engineer for WTIC in Hartford, and chief engineer for many stations stretching from Boston to New York. The answer to this week's trivia question, the claim is that the first Christmas tree in the United States was in this Connecticut town. What town is it? The answer, Windsor Locks. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to hear the story about the soldier who was on a farm in Windsor Locks and is said to have started the Christmas tree tradition in the United States. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.